Today, I want to talk about a subject that most people misunderstand. When people discuss money, they usually focus on one question: how do you get rich? But strangely enough, that is not the hardest financial question. The more difficult question is something else entirely. How do you avoid staying poor? You see, wealth is often built step by step over time, but poverty behaves very differently. Poverty has momentum, it has gravity, and if you don't understand that force, you can work very hard your entire life and still feel like you are standing in the same place. Let me explain this the way an investor might explain physics. Imagine a rocket sitting on the launch pad. When that rocket tries to leave Earth, it isn't simply flying upward, it's fighting something incredibly powerful, gravity. To escape the planet, it must reach a very specific speed known as escape velocity. Without that speed, no matter how strong the engines are, the rocket will eventually fall back down. Now, here is the fascinating part. If a rocket uses 90% of the fuel it needs, but fails to reach escape velocity, it doesn't travel 90% of the way to space. It crashes. And in many ways, this is exactly how the low-income cycle works. People wake up early, they work long hours, they save a little money, they try to climb higher. For a moment, it feels like progress. Then suddenly something happens. The car breaks down, a medical bill appears, rent goes up, a job disappears. And just like gravity pulling the rocket back to Earth, the system drags them down again, not halfway down, all the way back to the beginning, sometimes even lower than before. That experience is incredibly frustrating because it creates the illusion that effort doesn't matter. But the real issue is not effort. The issue is velocity. Small, linear effort often cannot break the gravitational pull of poverty. You see, poverty is not simply a lack of money sitting in a bank account. It behaves more like a closed system, a loop that constantly feeds itself. Low income creates stress. Stress creates poor decisions. Poor decisions prevent asset building. And without assets, income remains low. Around and around the cycle goes. Over time, that loop begins to feel permanent. But here's the important part. The system is not unbeatable. Just like gravity can be escaped by a rocket with enough thrust, the cycle of low income can be broken if you understand the forces working against you. And in my experience, there are 5 specific traps that keep people stuck near the ground. 5 invisible chains that quietly drain time, energy, and opportunity. If you learn to recognize those traps, and more importantly, how to break them, something remarkable begins to happen. The friction disappears, momentum builds, and eventually you reach your own financial escape velocity. So in this conversation, I want to walk through those 5 traps one by one and explain how people quietly break the cycle that holds so many others in place. Now, the first trap is something I like to call the scarcity tax. Most people assume that being poor simply means having less money. But in reality, poverty often makes everything more expensive. That sounds strange at first, yet when you look closely, you begin to see the pattern everywhere. When someone has capital, they can make decisions that reduce cost over time. They buy quality tools. They buy in bulk. They fix small problems before they become large ones. But when money is scarce, those options disappear. You are forced to solve problems only when they become emergencies. And emergencies are always expensive. There is an old story often referred to as the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness. The idea is simple. A wealthy person can afford a sturdy pair of boots for $50, those boots last 10 years. In other words, they spend $5 a year on footwear. A poor person cannot afford $50 today, so they buy the $10 boots. But those cheaper boots fall apart in a year. So next year, they buy another pair, $10 again. And again, over 10 years, the poor person ends up spending $100, twice as much as the wealthy person. And their feet were wet the entire time. That is the quiet mathematics of scarcity. The same pattern appears in dozens of places. Without savings, a small car repair turns into high interest credit card debt. Without preventative health care, a small cavity turns into a costly root canal. Without the ability to buy groceries in bulk, every trip to the store becomes slightly more expensive. Little by little, the system charges a premium for being broke. But the financial cost is only half of the problem. The deeper cost is psychological. Researchers studying financial stress have discovered something remarkable. When a person is constantly worried about money, about rent, bills, and survival, their mental bandwidth shrinks dramatically. It becomes harder to plan long-term, harder to evaluate decisions, harder to think clearly about the future. Your brain moves into survival mode. Instead of thinking about the next 5 years, you start thinking about the next 5 hours. And when that happens, people often make decisions that look irrational from the outside, but in reality, they are simply exhausted. They are trying to navigate complex financial problems with a mind that is under constant pressure. So the first step in breaking the low-income cycle is not investing. It is not starting a business. And it certainly isn't chasing risky opportunities. The first step is something much simpler. You build a buffer, a small emergency reserve, $500, maybe $1,000, not to spend, but to protect your decision making. Because the moment you have even a small financial cushion, something powerful happens. A broken car becomes an inconvenience, not a disaster. A surprise bill becomes manageable, not catastrophic. That little reserve doesn't just buy security. It buys clarity. It gives your mind the breathing room it needs to think again. And once your thinking improves, the next steps become possible. Once the scarcity tax begins to loosen its grip, another force reveals itself. And this one is far more emotional. I call it the dopamine trap. You may have heard people ask a question that sounds simple, but is often asked with judgment. If someone is struggling financially, why do they still buy expensive phones? Why new sneakers? Why take out food when cooking at home is cheaper? From the outside, those choices can look irrational, but when you look a little deeper into human behavior, the explanation becomes clearer. Living under constant financial pressure is exhausting. When money is tight for long enough, stress becomes a permanent companion. Cortisol levels remain elevated. Every bill feels like a small emergency. Every unexpected expense feels like a threat. And when the brain lives in that environment long enough, it begins searching for relief. It wants a moment, just a brief moment, where the pressure disappears. So when someone walks into a store and buys something new, a jacket, a phone, a pair of shoes, the brain releases dopamine. For a few minutes, everything feels different. Confidence returns, dignity returns. For a moment, the person no longer feels like they are losing. That moment of relief can be incredibly powerful. But here is where the trap quietly forms. The dopamine lasts maybe 20 minutes. The debt can last 20 years. And this is where you begin to notice a subtle difference in how money is viewed. For many people struggling financially, money becomes a tool for temporary pleasure, a way to escape the stress of the present. But people who eventually build wealth tend to see money very differently. To them, money is not primarily a tool for pleasure. It is a tool for freedom. When $500 appears in their life, their first question is not, what can I buy? It is, what can this grow into? That shift in perspective changes everything, because money can either leave your pocket or quietly start working on your behalf. This is the difference between liabilities and assets. A liability is something that takes money from you, a flashy car payment, a designer bag, a subscription you barely use. An asset, on the other hand, quietly adds money to your life. It might be a small investment, a skill that increases your earning power, or ownership in a productive business. One slowly drains your future. The other slowly builds it. Breaking the dopamine trap requires a temporary reset. Think of it as stepping away from noise long enough to hear your own thinking again. Some people call this monk mode. For a short period, maybe 6 months, you simplify everything. You remove unnecessary spending. You cancel subscriptions that add little value. You reduce consumption to the basics: food, shelter, transportation, learning. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, but something fascinating begins to happen. Instead of getting excitement from spending money, you start feeling satisfaction from watching your financial stability grow. The dopamine shifts, saving begins to feel rewarding, control begins to feel empowering, and once your happiness is no longer tied to buying things, something remarkable happens. You become far harder to manipulate because the system can no longer control you with shiny objects. And that is the moment a person begins to move from consumption toward ownership. Once someone escapes the dopamine trap, a third challenge appears. And this one is responsible for exhausting millions of people every single year. I call it the linear income trap. From the time we are young, most of us are taught a very simple equation about money. If you want more income, work more hours. It sounds reasonable. After all, time equals money. So people follow that formula. They take overtime shifts. They drive for ride-sharing services at night. They work weekends, sometimes even a second job. And for a while, the strategy seems to work. Income increases slightly, but there is a mathematical limit hidden inside that system. Time is finite. Every person on earth has exactly 24 hours in a day. A portion of those hours must be used for sleep. Some are used for commuting, eating, and basic life. What remains is limited. That means if your income is directly tied to your hours, your income will always have a ceiling, no matter how hardworking you are. But here is the problem many people discover too late. While your income is capped by time, your expenses are not. Prices continue rising. Groceries become more expensive. Rent climbs higher. Fuel costs increase. Economists call this inflation. You can think of inflation as a silent tax placed on anyone who earns money primarily by selling their time. Because when prices rise, faster than wages. Something subtle happens. Even if you work the same number of hours, even if you receive a small raise, your purchasing power slowly shrinks. It is a bit like running up a downward escalator. You are moving forward with great effort, but the ground beneath you keeps sliding the other way. And over time, that constant effort becomes exhausting. People sacrifice evenings with their families. They sacrifice their health. They sacrifice their energy. Yet somehow, the financial situation barely improves. The reason is simple. Effort alone does not determine income. Value does. The market does not pay people primarily for how hard they work. It pays them for how difficult they are to replace. And this is where a different strategy begins to matter. Instead of selling more hours, you begin building a skill stack. Most people try to become the absolute best in one narrow field. But there is another approach that can be surprisingly powerful. Become reasonably good at several complementary skills and combine them. For example, someone working in construction who also understands sales suddenly becomes much more valuable. They are not just completing the work, they can win the contracts as well. Or consider a restaurant employee who learns marketing or copywriting. They are no longer just serving food. They can help design menus, promotions, and campaigns that increase revenue. Individually, those skills may be common, but when they are stacked together, something interesting happens. The combination becomes rare. And rarity is what the market rewards. When your abilities create unique value, your income slowly detaches from the number of hours you work. Instead of being paid purely for time, you begin getting paid for solutions, and solutions can scale. That is the moment when income begins to move differently. Not linearly, but exponentially. Even after someone begins improving their skills and earning potential, there is another force that quietly pulls people backward. And in many cases, it is the hardest force to escape. I call it social gravity. There is an old observation that has circulated for many years. You eventually become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. At first glance, that sounds like a motivational quote, but there is actually a great deal of neuroscience behind it. Human beings are natural imitators. Inside the brain are special cells known as mirror neurons. These neurons constantly observe the behavior of people around us and subtly encourage us to copy it. We copy language. We copy habits. We even copy attitudes about money, success, and risk. If the people surrounding you constantly talk about opportunities, business ideas, and growth, you begin thinking that way as well. But if the environment around you is filled with frustration, complaints, and resignation, those ideas begin shaping your thinking too. Over time, that environment becomes normal. There is also a phenomenon often called the crab bucket effect. If you place a single crab in a bucket, it can crawl out easily, but when several crabs are inside the same bucket, something interesting happens. Whenever one crab begins climbing toward the edge, the others instinctively grab onto it and pull it back down. Not out of cruelty, simply because that is the natural reaction inside the group. The same dynamic sometimes appears in human environments. When someone begins saving money, learning new skills, or thinking about a different future, the people around them may respond with skepticism. You're working too hard. Relax a little. You think you're better than everyone else now? Sometimes those comments are made jokingly, but the message underneath can still be powerful. It suggests that staying where you are is safer than trying to move forward. This is what I mean by social gravity. It quietly pulls ambition back toward the familiar. Escaping that gravity does not mean abandoning your friends or family. That is neither necessary nor wise. But it does mean protecting your mindset. And fortunately, we live in a time when something remarkable is possible. You can choose your mentors through books, lectures, interviews, and long-form conversations. You can surround yourself with the thinking of extraordinary people. You can spend time learning from the ideas of thinkers like Charlie Munger or the scientific curiosity of Albert Einstein. You can study entrepreneurs, investors, and innovators who approach problems differently. Over time, the voices you listen to begin shaping your internal dialogue. Your mental neighborhood begins to change. And once your thinking environment changes, your decisions start changing as well. That is how people gradually escape the gravity of their surroundings. They build a new circle of influence, sometimes not in their physical world, but inside their minds. Now we arrive at the fifth and final force in the cycle. In many ways, this one is the engine that drives the entire system. I call it the compound void. Years ago, the physicist Albert Einstein reportedly described compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world. Whether he truly said it or not almost doesn't matter, because the principle itself is undeniably powerful. Compound interest is what happens when money begins generating more money, and that new money begins generating even more. Over time, the growth becomes exponential. But here is the problem. Most people caught in the low-income cycle experience compound interest in the worst possible way. They are not earning it. They are paying it. Credit cards charge 20% interest. Auto loans accumulate interest month after month. Student loans stretch for decades. Even when someone stops spending entirely, the balance continues growing quietly in the background. It is like rowing a small boat against a powerful current. You can paddle as hard as you want, but the river is still pushing you backward. Meanwhile, people who build wealth eventually cross to the other side of that equation. Instead of paying compound interest, they begin earning it. Their savings are invested. Their assets grow. A small piece of the economy begins working on their behalf every day. Many investors do this simply by owning broad market funds that track companies in indexes like the S&P 500. At first, the difference seems small, but over years and then decades, the snowball begins rolling downhill. And once momentum appears, the process becomes surprisingly powerful. Escaping this final trap usually happens in three stages. The first stage is survival. This is where someone focuses on stopping the financial bleeding. High interest debt becomes the enemy. Expenses are reduced. Every dollar is directed towards stabilizing the situation. The second stage is accumulation. This is where the person begins quietly purchasing assets, not flashy things, not speculative bets, just small, consistent investments in productive systems that grow over time. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as $10 a day invested regularly. It looks insignificant at first, but mathematics has extraordinary patience. The third stage is freedom. This moment arrives when the income produced by assets begins covering basic living expenses. When that happens, something remarkable occurs. For the first time, survival is no longer tied directly to selling hours. The gravitational pull weakens, options appear, time becomes flexible again. This is the financial version of escape velocity. When that moment arrives, life begins to feel different. The constant friction disappears. Decisions become calmer. And instead of struggling against gravity, you finally begin to move with momentum. Looking back, the path becomes clearer. The scarcity tax drained mental energy. The dopamine trap encouraged short-term relief. The linear income trap kept people exhausted. Social gravity tried to pull ambition back down, and the compound void quietly worked against them. But once those forces are understood, they lose much of their power because the door of the cage was never truly locked. It only appeared that way. And the moment someone chooses to step through that open door, the trajectory of their life can change forever. If there is one idea I hope stays with you after this conversation, it is this: poverty is rarely just about money. It behaves more like gravity. The scarcity tax drains your clarity. The dopamine trap distracts your discipline. The linear income trap exhausts your time. Social gravity pulls your ambition back down. And the power of compounding quietly works against you instead of for you. But none of these forces are permanent. They are patterns, and patterns can be changed. Step by step, a small buffer restores your thinking. Better habits reclaim your control. New skills increase your value. Better influences reshape your mindset. And disciplined investing turns time into an ally. At first, the progress feels invisible. But one day, almost suddenly, momentum appears, and that is the moment everything changes. Not because life becomes easy, but because gravity no longer owns you.